Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining the Great Dynamics podcast. My name is Ahmed Hassan, and today with me, a reoccurring guest, Marcel Plichta. Marcel, as I think people who follow the podcast will probably know already, is a part of the team at Great Dynamics, and he's currently doing his PhD at St. Andrews, and he was a former analyst at the DIA. And today we're going to talk about a couple of interesting things that are happening in the world. Obviously, we're going to speak about intelligence, tradecraft related topics, because I know a lot of you that listen to this podcast want that. So let's get into it. Marcel, welcome.
Thanks. Good to be back.
So what's been keeping you busy lately?
I've been focused on a couple of different things. I just had an article run that I co-authored with Zach Kallenborn, who might actually be a good podcast guest, but that's another issue. It's for CSIS, the think tank, and it's on UGVs and then the potential for UGVs in Ukraine, unmanned ground vehicles.
All right. Very interesting. I know that people probably wondering like what our opinion is on Finland's joining NATO. So yeah, let's start off with that.
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of the hot news right now. Although I think there needs to be a little bit of context in the sense that Finland is joining NATO, and there's obviously stuff that Russia has to worry about as a result of that. Right? Finland has a very, very long border with Russia, and the Soviet Union fought a very high profile war in the 1940s, and there was in the 1930s, and there was some semi-colonial history before that. Right? Depending on who you ask. And it's also, Finland maintains a large military, right? I think they spend more than 2% of their GDP on defense. So they're sort of formidable militarily in a way that not all NATO allies are. So it's a bigger issue for Russia. But, it's also worth pointing out that this really just formalizes a longer trend in partnership between NATO and Finland. Finland has sort of been a NATO partner for some time. They were one of the initial joiners of the Partnership for Peace, which was a NATO sort of program to reach out to former Soviet countries, and they were as well as other countries, because Finland wasn't a Soviet country, of course. And they were involved in joint operations and exercises with NATO for a long time, and they obviously had relationships with the other Scandinavian countries that were bilateral. So this is. Obviously, Finland joining NATO is notable, but it is worth pointing out that sort of Finland has been sort of in partnership working with NATO for quite some time. So it's not necessarily quite as much of a shock for Russia as sort of, Twitter might be making it out to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also people underestimate, as you said, how prepared Finland is as a country and as a people because of lessons learned in the recent history. And I think, as you said about the border, like some people might know that know me, but I have an interesting relationship with Finland, and I won't go too deep into that. But I will say that I think the Russians are definitely worried in the sense that this is not Estonia, for example, or any of the Baltics, and not saying anything bad about them. They each have made significant strides in their development of their military. But I think not just in the US, but in some places in Europe, even so-called experts don't know how well Finland is being prepared and have been doing exercises for years with the US military, with, as you said, with other Nordic countries. And now there is this plan for Nordic countries to combine their air forces and function more like one organization. I think that's an interesting prospect. And particularly if you have in mind that Finland is getting the F-35s.
Indeed.
For their Air Force. I think they ordered like 68 of them. So that's going to be an interesting one, especially if you look at interoperability and standardization. The one thing I haven't really seen people talk about, and I think this will be an interesting conundrum, is that like Finland's small arms, because it's still based on Warsaw Pact.
Yeah.
Small arms. What do you think of that?
I mean, so I think when it comes to interoperability, I think the biggest issues tend to be those like big systems, right? Like the aircraft and the vehicles. And my understanding is that, I mean, before the F-35s, Finland flew F-18s. I think they were flying other Scandinavian countries' planes as well. So there is, and obviously Finnish defense folks want to export, to NATO countries as well. So they're sort of taking on interoperability themselves. With the small arms, yeah, I think their main service rifle is, a sort of non-NATO standard caliber. And I think part of their deal was that they weren't going to change that basically until the end of the service life of that particular rifle, which, I mean, fair enough. I know part of the Finnish model is sort of conscription and more along the lines of mass mobilization. So you don't necessarily want to have a gap where you don't have enough rifles for everyone, if that's the case. But, Finland isn't the first country, I think, that had a large stock of Soviet, Soviet era or sort of older non-NATO standard weapons. So I think it's not necessarily the biggest issue. It might complicate, supply chains if something really big went down really quickly. But I think in the long term, that's an easier issue to iron out than if they're like, air defense systems or tanks or aircraft weren't interoperable. I think one last thing to sort of bring up on this issue is the NATO Russia Founding Act of 1997, which of course everyone is intimately familiar with already. I'm just kidding. Basically, it's where NATO promised that NATO wasn't going to station units permanently in countries that bordered Russia unless it was part of that country's national military. This is why a lot of the NATO forces stationed in the Baltic countries are expressed as a rotation, because you need to rotate troops in and out. You can't permanently base them there, the way that the US does in Germany, for instance, which doesn't border Russia. The future of this agreement is sort of totally up in the air right now because of the war in Ukraine. So this sort of leads to a situation where you could have, hypothetically, NATO troops stationed permanently in Finland if Finland agrees to it, in the long term. And that's another calculation Russia has to make is, not only is Finland, as we know from history, a bit difficult to invade, and not only do they have a competent military of their own, but there's a growing issue of how NATO will act to shore up Finland's defenses even more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this question was brought up just before in the process of joining NATO. I think Finland said they were open for bases, but Sweden not so much. I might be wrong. We have two really good articles actually on greatdynamics.com. A shameless plug there. I think they give you a lot of insight of like the strategic mindset of Sweden and Finland. And we have to pay attention to, there were just elections in Finland and the ruling party lost. So there might be different calculations in parliament, even though there was a wide support for joining NATO. So I don't think that will change necessarily. But the appetite to have foreign troops based in Finland, particularly since Finland and Sweden maintained for a long time their neutrality, would be an interesting prospect, not just for Finland, but for Russia and how it will calculate that. And the last thing I wanted to say is obviously the competition for the Arctic. Well, Finland plays
very much,
an important role. They used to have access to the Arctic Sea, but since I think the continuation war, even the winter war, they don't have that anymore. They lost considerable territory to Russia. So that's an interesting prospect. What's going to happen? That's going to heat up even more. And yeah, I'm because I have family in Finland. For me, it's interesting so I follow it on different fronts, and I've written in the past a lot about Finland. It's a very interesting country, and I'm cautiously optimistic about this decision to join NATO.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that for Finland, it's a very clear calculation. It's not so much about sort of like broader abstract things, right? Like European solidarity or stuff like that. When you look at sort of the polling in Finland at times where it was more in favor of joining NATO, for most of Finland's history, they've been opposed to it, but for where it got closest to net positive for NATO was like closer to 2008, right? The invasion of Georgia by Russia, quite close in 2014, 2015 during the first Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it's, I think it's a very clear cost benefit analysis for Finns, I think.
Yeah. And I think now looking at obviously the invasion in Ukraine, I don't know what the calculation was there for the Russians, but obviously it turned out so much worse than even their best of planners could have thought. And you mentioned beginning of the podcast, you and a colleague wrote about UGVs, unmanned ground vehicles, and how they could play a role. Before you go into that and you go into the applications in Ukraine, I just wanted to say that I find it interesting that Russia has been fielding UGVs in combat roles or logistic roles in Syria, but we have not seen them once in Ukraine. I don't know if you guys talked about that, but I would love to hear more about, not just from the West, but also from Russia's side.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, we didn't talk about Russian use of UGVs in Syria specifically. We sort of mentioned at the beginning, Russia made a lot of hay about its deployment of the Marker UGV. And this is sort of a trend that we saw when we were looking at, for both sides, UGVs, was there's a lot more sort of press releases about them than there are actual footage of their use. And that could just be because there's, only so much combat footage, only so much footage, especially of a sensitive or sensitive system. But yeah, the Marker, I don't think I've seen any videos of it being used in combat, or the sort of a set of more ad hoc UGVs you see. I don't know if you've seen the Twitter videos where they'll attach like a big generator or a battery to the back of a trailer, and it looks like MacGyver, like a really ramshackle stuff.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing right now is press from both sides about I guess I don't know what you would term them, but they're sort of like mobile mines, right? So it's a UGV that's essentially just a race car or 4 wheels, and it just has an anti-tank mine on the top of it. Supposedly these are going to be driven under vehicles or into trenches and detonated. So there's that. In terms of what we talked about in the article in more detail, it was more about the potential benefits to sending UGVs, because there's a lot of UGVs in development. There's a lot of UGVs that are being prototyped right now that the US military and other militaries are looking at, and they're looking to integrate. So there's benefits potentially to sending them to Ukraine for both lethal and non-lethal applications. So, lethally, obviously, I think there's a lot of press and coverage about, mounting rifles on them, mounting small artillery or launchers, or putting AI into them. But there's also a lot of non-lethal applications as well, right? Something that Ukraine needs very, very desperately is ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and particularly sensors that can see at night and can see infrared. And so a lot of UGVs that are on the market do sort of support those sensors. And a lot of them, especially the larger ones, have masts. So they can put that sensor, above an obstacle, above a tree line. And it's safer than sending someone up there to go take a look.
Yeah. And I think there is there's a robotics company in Estonia, Milram Robotics. I think they are pretty advanced, and they have fielded their platform, I believe, in Mali with the Estonian military for logistics.
They also sent some to Ukraine.
All right.
Allegedly. Yeah, the Themis. The Themis I think is it seems like Estonia and Turkey are a little bit ahead right now, to me at least, in terms of actually having these things out and about. The Themis is a great example of a trend that we're seeing in UGVs, which is that they're very, very modular. So a Themis could just as easily carry stuff or do casualty evacuations as it could, be a platform to launch a drone from, or do ISR, or be a firefighter. It's very versatile, and that's one of the reasons why it would be interesting to sort of see how they perform in Ukraine, to see what roles in what roles they make things safer for personnel, and what roles they're more effective, and in what roles they aren't. I think we're seeing that very much with the UAVs in Ukraine, in terms of what they're effective for, what they're useful for, where these things are trending, and a little bit for USVs. If you look at the attacks on the Russian Navy with unmanned surface vessels, I think UGVs are another field where we could see more developments and see where the future of UGVs is headed.
Yeah, very interesting. I think what I'm a little bit surprised about with the amount of footage, I mean, there's thousands of hours now on combat footage in Ukraine, but certain weapon systems and solutions that we know have been fielded, there are no videos or images from. Do you think that's under strict communication with the manufacturer, or Is there something the Ukrainian intelligence feels that they don't want to share that, or is it just very limited use and that's why it's not really showing up?
I think it's all of the above. I also think that I get the impression that some Ukrainian units are less camera shy than others. Right. I think that some units are more willing to film themselves and do vlogs and fundraise. Especially, I think a lot of artillery units are big fans of doing that, because then they can sell, writing your name on the shell and stuff like that. Yeah. But I do think if something's like a sensitive technology, or that it's the way that Ukraine is using them or employing them is sensitive, then yeah, I think it's less likely that you're going to see footage of it. I think I've seen very few videos of like a purpose-built UGV. A lot of them have been, guys, very far behind the front lines, playing with an RC car that they modified. There's a lot more footage of that than there is of anything that a company has purpose-built.
I mean, I say this, I mentioned this interesting development because one of the weapon systems that we have written about is, the Switchblade, as you call them, one-way attack drones. And there's maybe, like, obviously I don't follow Ukraine as well as maybe other places on Earth, but there's maybe like a handful of videos of that system. And we know that they're there. They've been sold thousands. So that's a very interesting one, an example of a system that you barely get to see on video in Ukraine. And speaking of Ukraine, there's no podcast that goes by and we don't talk about Wagner. They've become a staple, I think, of this podcast. We are going to do a dedicated Wagner podcast where I think multiple people as a panel and discuss, because I know that there are different views of Wagner. Particularly, there's a different Wagner in Ukraine than there is in Central African Republic or in Mali or Sudan, right? So there are different phases and different applications. And me and Marcel talk about Wagner probably every other day in our communications. But I'm also interested in the other PMCs, right? The Reduts, the Patriot. I mean, there's probably over a dozen by now that has been mentioned. But if we talk about Wagner, we talk about their activities. The incident that happened, speaking of great power competition, in Central African Republic, where 9 Chinese miners were killed. The first comments that came out was Wagner. Then it was a little bit pushed back against. And where are we with that right now?
Yeah, it's one of those cases where there's like a lot of claims and not as much evidence, and the actors who are investigating the claims are themselves not as trustworthy. They're not impartial, I should say. So you had 9 Chinese miners killed, a few more wounded. There wasn't really a lot of evidence on who did it. The government came out immediately and said it was the CPC, which is a rebel coalition. It's a big organization. There's a lot of rebel subgroups in it, right? So there's a lot of range for an actor to sort of go rogue in a sense and kill some miners. And so the government comes out and says it's the CPC. So the press goes to the CPC for comment. And they say, no, it was Wagner that did it. And it's so we're sort of left in a limbo of sorts where there's not a lot of hard evidence that ties it to either. And there's motive for both. I would say that there's slightly more motive for Wagner in the sense that they have previously gone after Chinese miners across the country. There was an incident a couple years ago where they stole like excavators. Well, stole's a strong, is not quite what happened. They requisitioned them forcefully from Chinese miners, we should say.
They borrowed them without giving them back.
Yeah. And yeah, so there has been clashes, and Wagner is active in that area. There's a Great Dynamics article on Geo in Car for Wagner sites. One of them is one of the mining sites in the area. So Wagner has its own sort of mining interest in the area, and they've had clashes with Chinese miners before. But rebel groups have also had sort of clashes with Chinese miners, although less lethally, I would say. Less. You very recently had several, and this was since the killing of 9 Chinese miners. You had 13 or 3. Yeah, you had a set of Chinese miners that were just released. I think it was 3. There were 13 soldiers abducted and 3 miners. Three Chinese miners were freed by the CPC after some negotiations on the complete other side of the country. So you have two big actors with a lot of sort of local autonomy on the ground, and a lot of potential motive. And so it's become more of a statement of not necessarily bias, but a statement that you're more against Wagner than the CPC, or you're more against CPC than the Wagner in terms of who you blame for this. It is worth pointing out that the Chinese government is very eager to get to the bottom of it. I think their ambassador in Bangui, the capital, has sort of demanded to be involved in the investigation. The government and the government official in charge of the investigation has visited Wagner's camp outside of Bangui as well. So there's whether he was there to ask some questions, or whether he was there to know what questions not to ask is another matter, I suppose. So it's messy. And I think the most recent piece of news is that the government sort of claimed that they found the perpetrators, which they claimed to be CPC, and they claimed that it was like three guys from a CPC subgroup that they captured, who just happened to have all 9 passports, one rifle. So basically they and it could well be the case that they were dumb enough to keep all of the evidence of their murder and send it off with 3 guys in the middle of nowhere. But it seems that a lot of commentators are thinking that it's a bit of a stitch up. So yeah, it's an evolving story.
Right. If it was Wagner, then what would be the motive?
So Wagner has been growing in CAR as a sort of a commercial actor. They are involved in running a convoy from CAR into Cameroon to get access to the port, because CAR is landlocked. They've been involved in selling beer. They've been involved in selling beer and vodka. They've been involved in mining as well in that area.
Course.
Yeah, of course. But it's, I think there was also recently news of essentially them going after Castel, which is a French company, for the sugar trade. So they're becoming more and more interested in getting different revenue streams from their operations in CAR. I mean, on a local level, it's not clear how centrally directed Wagner is, and it's possible that they decided, we want access to this mine. We've had enough. We're going to go intimidate them, and maybe things got out of hand, or maybe some actors on the ground decided that they're just going to try and get away with it. It's one of those cases where we sort of need more evidence, because at this point it just becomes like a speculation. But there is there's more than no motive, I guess is what I would say.
No, it's an interesting one. I mean, the question is on Wagner in Africa growing, and I mean, I think a little bit too late, especially if you look at the countries that they're in. And we've talked about it at length, I think, in other podcasts, but also, during our Sahel coverage, the countries that they're involved in and to what extent they're involved in. But I'm very interested to see what sort of steps are being taken to combat that, or I don't know, because the point is, from a lot of African perspectives, and if I may speak for an African perspective, I feel that there is far more support for Russia or Russians than there is Western, particularly countries like France, or colonial history. And I think that's a very interesting one. I had a conversation with somebody who is in the defense industry yesterday, where we talked about how countries like Russia, but also Turkey and to some extent Iran even, is going into countries that Western peers believe that, there's nothing there, or there's a misunderstanding, or they have such a low risk appetite that they don't even want to try. But then these actors are there, and then they ask themselves, how is that possible? We follow good governance and they don't. And I think that risk taking, particularly if you look at Wagner, is an interesting one, because it is a state enterprise, whatever they say. So I don't know what your opinion is on, particularly from a U.S. Foreign policy perspective.
I mean, I've been very negative about U.S. Africa policy for a while publicly. So I mean I think it's mostly just that there's an element of dismissiveness and hubris to it, in the sense that for the longest time, for the longest time since the end of the Cold War, right? The West was the only game in town, right? If you're going to be a state like Eritrea, you don't really have a counterbalance to the West. If you sort of launch a coup or something, there's and you don't have the West's support when you do it, I should say. The West was the only game in town, and the sort of international communities, the World Bank and all these institutions were sort of your only real option. I mean, I guess you had like Gaddafi for a while as as sort of we have counterbalance at home kind of deal. But what we're seeing with and it's not just Russia, right? It's China economically, more so than security, the UAE, Turkey, right? And to a certain extent, I think we'll probably see some African countries sort of emerge in a more proactive role. I think maybe Ethiopia, Rwanda for sure. Potentially South Africa might be interested in sort of getting involved a little bit more again. Potentially Nigeria and Ethiopia if their internal issues are get a bit better. So there's a lot of other options now, at least from the perspective of protecting your regime if you're an African leader who's sort of on the outs with the West. So there is a bit of a hubris in saying, in suddenly the West turning around and going, oh my gosh, like I can't believe these African countries don't want to work with us after we've sort of after we've had this not complete autonomy but enormous, basically uncontested influence in Africa, and it still hasn't resolved a lot of the core issues Africans face, right, in the security realm and in the economic realm, in the regional integration realm. So I think it's a good sign that Macron is going around saying, I'm going to scale back France's military presence in Africa, and I'm going to co-locate. When there are French forces, they're more likely to be co-located with host nation forces. I think it's good that U.S. officials are. I think Kamala Harris just went to Ghana, I think, and promised $150 million. I think it's a bit late, right? The time to have invested in African partnerships and African prosperity has been the last 20 or 30 years, and I think that this is more of a reaction to the prospect of losing uncontested influence that is driving this more so than a genuine effort to make partnerships with Africa. And I think Africans know that. I think Africans are sort of aware what the drivers of U.S. engagement are, and are aware that it could go away if Africa doesn't become quite as intense an arena for great power competition as U.S. military commentators are saying on blogs and on think tanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's cool to talk about how it's how to talk about like hard power and military power in great power competition. And talk about things like hypersonic missiles and, war in space or militarization of space and these type of things. But it's the grassroots where particularly the West's lunch is being eaten. If you look at, there was an example, we talked about this in a previous podcast where Zelensky did a speech for the African Union and only 3 leaders turned.
Yeah.
And which is a bit of an embarrassment because, like, first of all, just to think, because everybody in the West has been applauding Zelensky whenever he shows up, and in certain cases they should, to think about, Africans will just fall in line and they will do it too. And also speaking about Africans as a monolith is obviously wrong because it's over 50 countries and they have different, competing policies and understandings and cultures. But for only 3 to show up, for me, it was very telling. And I think the opportunity that at the end of the day, there's a lot of interest through grain and, fertilizer from Ukraine as well as Russia that Africans rely on. So they're not anti-Ukrainian. They're just not pro-Ukrainian. And they rather stand in the middle and don't pick sides.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point because when sort of the United Nations General Assembly, right, voted to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a lot was made about African countries not supporting Ukraine. But if you look, the vast majority of African countries that didn't vote in favor of that measure abstained, They didn't vote against it. You know, you had like Eritrea who like, okay, cool, no one cares, voting against it. But the vast majority of African countries are rightly focused on a lot of regional and local issues, and don't necessarily feel that they should be putting everything they've got into an issue that does impact them, right? The supply of fertilizer, the supply of grain. In the case of countries like Algeria, right, the supply of weapons. But I don't know. Ultimately, I think there's just sort of a ambivalence towards it.
There's one thing I've spoken about this in private, or I've spoken about this with clients and people that ask me about it. But I also think it's a missed opportunity. I know the Ukrainians had a lot on his mind, and Zelensky had a lot on his mind. But when the second invasion broke out, and there was this mass exodus of refugees and people leaving Ukraine, you saw a lot of images from media outlets and maybe not as many Western outlets, where you saw like very open, hostile discrimination of African, right? African students that were there studying Ukraine and had nothing to do with the invasion or staying for that because they're not citizens. And the treatment of Africans has not gone unnoticed in a lot of African capitals and in leadership. So Zelensky right there could have said, hey, cut this out. We're in this together. We need to support. But not a peep came from the Ukrainian government. Not a single peep. And then, like, I've spoken to people from multiple countries close to leadership, and that is a thought that went into their minds also. Like, all right, so when our people were in trouble and needed support too, you were not there, right? So there are, outside of like local issues and regional issues you mentioned, there are personal ones too. When some media outlets are saying, hey, this is different than Afghanistan, or this is different than Syria, or this is different than Ethiopia, Eritrea refugees, and these people look like us, they are from civilized Europe. This is not helping you in any shape or fashion. And if there's no pushback against that, I mean, commentators have pushed back again, but like mainstream or legacy media has not really made a big point. Maybe the Al Jazeeras of this world. But I think that's an important point to have, because when we cover Africa as Great Dynamics, we saw that in Sahel Week, we get pushback. Oh, you guys are just holding the Western line, right? Even though we are publishing intelligence, we're disseminating intelligence and not opinion pieces, or where there's no such, for us, unless it's like an article where we can be more, the author has more opportunity to talk about their vision and their argument. I think in an intelligence report, we don't pick sides. We just talk about what we think is going on and what's going to happen next, right? And so speaking about Wagner's crimes in Mali is not saying that, well, France is better, or France's atrocities in CAR are better, or something like that. We're not saying that. We're just saying like, hey, this is what's going on. The violence recorded is far more than the last 10 years combined in 2022. These are worrying signs, and the country is looking like it's going back into a failed state. I mean, somebody told me about Burkina Faso is maybe 3 major attacks away of being a failed state, right? Which is super worrying, right? And something to think about. So I just wanted to mention that because, and as some people listening to this podcast may not know this, but I was born in Africa, so, and I consider myself still African, even though I grew up in the West, and I've spent, and when people message me or comment on Great Dynamics work and say, well, maybe you should go to these countries. I've been to these countries, long periods of time. I worked in these countries and I've spoken to a lot of people, which is why I think we are authoritative enough to talk about it. Sorry, I went off on a little bit of a rant there, but there's something I wanted to say because it's been something that's been bothering. And in these podcasts, we can talk a little bit more about that than in a situation where I'm talking with a guest who's speaking about their own projects and these type of things. But coming back to where we were, Something I wanted to talk to you also about was, you've written a lot about one-way attack drones, and they use it in Ukraine from the Ukrainian side as well as from the Russian side, and the pivotal role of Iran in supplying those drones. We've seen attacks now in Syria against US forces by Iranian-backed militias and using Iranian drones. Have you looked at that, and what's your opinion and what's your insight on that development?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna talk too much about the state of the Syrian conflict, just because that's not necessarily my area. But in terms of these two recent attacks, I think the first was in January and the second was in March. And these aren't the first instances of attacks on coalition bases where U.S. forces and Syrian forces are co-located. I shouldn't say Syrian forces, and it's not the Syrian military, but
SDF,
U.S. partners in Syria. The first of these two attacks in January is, I think, the one we know the most about at this point. And it's interesting to talk about for a couple of reasons. The main takeaway is that they launched, I guess, 3 Iranian-made drones, and these aren't Shaheds, right? These aren't the I guess more sophisticated kind of one-way attack drones. They looked like ones that have been supplied to this region for a while, have been supplied to Yemen, etc. Shorter range, smaller payload, but still a challenge. What's interesting about this is that the base they launched against had at least one Coyote counter UAS system, which is one of the U.S. government has put a lot of money into countering small drones and smaller drones. This is one of the systems that they've deployed for that. And it did successfully shoot down 2 of the drones, but the third one got through and injured a bunch of people. I don't necessarily know whether this is the case for the second one yet, because a lot of details haven't come out. But with the second one, it seems like there was a radar down at that base, so their detection of these drones was lower. I don't know necessarily. Some people said that was purposeful. That these militia groups knew that U.S. radars were down. I'm not totally sure if that's the case, but it did end up killing a U.S. contractor and injuring a bunch of other people.
Yeah. Do you think, like we saw in Saudi Arabia and UAE, where the Houthis were launching drones and cruise missiles, do you think that this is also probing of US-made counter-UAS solutions could be replicated perhaps in Ukraine or other places?
I think it's definitely revealing a weakness with these systems, which I think has also been revealed in Saudi and the UAE, which is that, at a certain point, mass will overcome some of these systems. And this is especially the case and this is where it's really relevant for the US for expeditionary warfare, right? Where you have, a remote base, right? Or a FOB or an outpost, that doesn't necessarily have as sophisticated a detection and CUAS network as like the mainland US or a larger installation might. So it's revealing. My understanding is, at least for these attacks, it was more to impose costs on the US presence in Syria, which it successfully did, right? Because it sort of brought the issue of US presence in Syria back into the limelight. I was watching the Secretary of Defense and, other senior military people testify before Congress, right? And this was suddenly, in the middle of the Ukraine war and in the middle of broader discussions about competition with China, right? Syria was suddenly at the forefront of that discussion. So it's, I think it's less that it's sort of a tactical benefit for learning about the Coyote, and more both a reflection of how useful one-way attack drones are as a way to impose costs on the US, and sort of the strategic messaging of we can touch you, we can touch your bases without running up close with like a mortar or other ways that militants have historically gone after US bases.
Yeah, very interesting. This concept, I think, what's his name? John Robb, who I would love to have on the podcast, wrote a book about this, A New Way of War, where he talks about, I think he calls it open source warfare, where using low cost techniques against high cost targets can cause supply chain disruptions. And I thought that was very interesting. And we are seeing that now, the stuff that he talked about maybe 8 or 9 years ago. We're seeing now more and more. Obviously, we saw the Ukraine, we're seeing it in Myanmar. I want to do a podcast on Myanmar because I think what's happening there is very interesting but also important to follow. And there's the great power competition also plays a role in that country, where different factions are supported by different countries and agencies around the world. I think, we've gone a little bit longer than we normally do, but I wanted to talk to you about one of the favorite search engine optimized topics online right now, ChatGPT and its role in intelligence analysis. We've written a little bit about it and we've spoken about it in a previous episode. I think it was the episode with Mike Evans. But I know you wanted to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah.
Or go into it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, so generally, right, there's a lot of discussion about ChatGPT, and I think it's caused a new wave of anxiety, right? Like, are robots going to replace us? That sort of anxiety that existed 30 or 40 years ago is now sort of happening again, but for a different segment of the workforce, we should say.
Yeah.
But there's also been sort of a growing discourse about the use of ChatGPT in intelligence. And it's sort of, it feels like a really limited discussion to me because they almost always talk about it as a tool for intelligence analysis. But it strikes me that the main benefit of ChatGPT, if we're going to engage in the problematic traditional intelligence cycle, right? And I was planning to talk about a little bit about this in the course that we're going to launch down the line. Its main utility, it seems to me, is in the processing stage, because there's a lot of information out there, that's collected. There's a lot, even within just open source or even just within social media, right? There's a lot more data than an individual analyst or an individual collector could possibly process themselves in traditional methods. I think where ChatGPT and sort of generative AI is going to be very obviously coming in handy is sort of sorting that and making sense of it. And even if it doesn't do it perfectly, if it's able to do, 80%, right, of what you need, that saves you a lot of time and energy. And it gives you as an organization, right, and as a analyst or a processor, it gives you a competitive advantage, right? I was watching a webcast on using ChatGPT, and one of the speakers said, it's not that AI will replace you, it's that a person using AI who knows how to use AI effectively will replace you.
Bingo.
In the way that someone who knows how to use a computer would have replaced you 40 or 50 years ago. Yeah. So there's that. I think it's also useful potentially for dissemination. If you put together a lot of work and you put it and you give it to an AI and you say, make this into briefing slides, make this into a graphic that's visually pleasing. I think there's also that as well. But those are the real for if you're like an intelligence analyst or you're involved in the intelligence cycle or you're an intelligence manager. I think that's where you get the most value add. Because I've tried to get ChatGPT, and granted, ChatGPT is not the only AI, right? It's not going to be. But I've tried to get it to do intelligence assessments and stuff, and it doesn't really work that well. No. And granted, I could just be giving it the wrong prompts, and we're still in an early stage, but I think there's more utility for the hard, easy questions, less the interpretive stuff.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think on the side of connection plans, designing a connection plan format, or if you pose a question or you pose a problem to ChatGPT saying, what are my information collection requirements, collection requirements assessment that you can do. Well, maybe it's not an assessment. It's just that it can give you ideas where to go from there. And also where structured analytic techniques, and we will go into this in the course too, but looking at things like indicators and warning. And indicators and warning, you can put in a piece of text or a problem into ChatGPT and say, hey, can you give me 5 indicators that I should be worrying about or that I should be looking at to monitor if this is going to escalate or de-escalate? So these type of things, I think it can do and can do to a decent standard for it to be useful. And I really like it. I have no qualms about it. The one qualm I would have about it is the data it's trained on.
Yeah.
Because I hear that it's not connected to the internet, but I think it is.
I mean, it obviously is. I'll give it a hyperlink and I'll tell it to respond to it.
Yeah.
I did that as a joke once on Twitter because there was an alarmist article about ChatGPT. So I asked ChatGPT to reflect on it and replied with that reply.
Yeah.
And it could read it.
No, it's interesting.
It could read it. So I think there is going to be a bigger question, right? Of, ChatGPT is just one company's generative AI.
Mm-hmm.
And right now it's free, right? And I do wonder if we're going to get to the point where we're going to have like competing AI products, and if we're going to have like AI as a search engine, you know what I mean? Like you're going to have ChatGPT and then ChatGPT Enterprise, with a lot of the regulations taken off. I get the impression that this is a very free and open space right now, and that I think it's not going to be as free and open going forward, if that makes sense.
Well, they have a plus version, right,
yeah,
that you can pay for, right? It doesn't give you as much, but especially if you look at, I think ChatGPT right now runs on GPT-3 framework, and as when GPT-4 comes in ChatGPT, it's going to be very interesting to see, because I've played around with that a little bit, and that is also sometimes it's scary how good it is at certain things. And particularly if you want to find very niche topics, I think, as you said earlier about this, that I think it's a tool like anything else that can empower the process of an intelligence analyst. And I think, if you can use it to your benefit without feeding it sensitive data, then you should, use it, and you should, use it as an advantage. And there are people that I know, consultants, other types of jobs, that tell me now that their whole job has been condensed from a full 40-hour week to a 1.5 day a week that they are working on these problems, right?
Yeah. Just don't tell the boss that, right?
Yeah. And for us as our own team in Great Dynamics, I encourage people to use it, but don't use it to write your reports, because I can tell. Right now, I can tell if they used it. But I think our team is honest enough to also know, like, hey, this is not working for me, or this would be considered, reckless to take an assessment from ChatGPT that would fundamentally change what my sourcing or my sources are saying. So in that regard, I am very positive about it, and I encourage people to use it, particularly in, the editing of their work, as you said, summarizing for the dissemination. Proofreading, right? We did a little experiment on active voice and passive voice, right? And I put in a prompt where I said, create a table on the left side, put in all the examples of passive voice, and on the right side, put in all the active versions of that, right? So the analyst then has the opportunity to pick and choose which one he would use or which one they would leave.
Yeah.
Right. So there's an alternative so in those kind of situations, I really like it, and I think it's really good. And as you said, I think Benjamin Strick was a guest on the show, and I really respect his work. He put in some interesting prompts on LinkedIn where, you create an article, and you take that article and you say, create from the article, put it into a table, make a précis from that article, create a 5-minute a piece slide deck for that article, create a video script of the article, create a Twitter thread of the article. These are, from dissemination perspective, very interesting things that, I think marketing, copywriting, tech is using. And I think us as intelligence professionals can learn from that, and we can pick and choose what we use. But I think it's beneficial right now to use it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it also highlights the need to, as an analyst, sort of work on developing skills that AI just doesn't have. Those sort of critical thinking skills, those, your understanding of what your audience, right, what your intelligence customer wants. And that way AI isn't necessarily replacing you. It's just replacing all the work you don't want to do.
Exactly.
And all the busy work.
Yeah. That is well said. I think we've mentioned this a couple of times, and we are almost towards the end of our of this podcast, but also to the end of the development of the course that we've been working on for a while now. And I think these are the type of things that will play a role in what tools and what techniques we give analysts to not just do intelligence analysis or research or investigations or anything that you would do in that type of role today, but also how that role would look tomorrow, right? And somewhat future-proofing, your career in a sense and your skill set. And it's a continuous process. And, if you don't learn, it's learn or die. It's a bit extreme thing to say, but that's the world that we live in today, So you have to continuously develop yourself and understand also that our intelligence consumers are also learning and they're asking questions about these tools and these techniques and the world at large. And I think that's something that we at Great Dynamics, we embody that. I feel that's, have been our quest from the beginning, looking at novel problems, looking at novel techniques, looking at novel uses of technology by groups, non-state actors, as well as state actors. So, and we will keep on doing that. And I think that's an interesting domain. And I think we feel very comfortable in it. And if anybody's interested in it, I would say, follow us on social media. But above all, there is something that we don't talk about enough is, subscribe to greatdynamics.com and get a subscription, because you can read our complete reports, our complete insights, as well as, if you're a top secret subscriber, you can communicate directly with us, with the analysts that you want to read their work. You can perhaps direct their attention to certain problems and issues that you're interested in. And it's a growing community, and we are very selective in who we let it, but that makes the community, I think, so strong. And, sorry for that little sales pitch there, Marcel.
No, it is true though. I think the way it works right now is, when you click on someone's report, and you're not subscribed, you see the top line judgments. And those are good. Those are useful in and of themselves. But I think a lot of people, when they're doing research, they want to know, the fuller picture, more of the context behind it, maybe some of the background, the history of it. And that's what the subscription gets you is, in addition to, access to the analyst, you also get, a lot more context for the key judgments and stuff in the reports.
Yeah. And sourcing.
Yeah. And sourcing.
That's the other one. And for people that I've been asked this before, majority of our sourcing is not just open source. There are human sources in there too. We don't spell their names out in it, or we don't link them necessarily, but we do mention that in our analytic summary at the end, which is something that actually Marcel pioneered to adding that into our reports.
Yeah, I mean, and that's something that, as much as it benefits an analyst, right, to think about where their sources are coming from, what gaps there might be. It also benefits you as a subscriber to read that analytic summary and basically not just see all of the information, but see where the analyst is coming from. See that the analyst has obviously considered the other possibilities before assessing one way or the other on an issue.
Absolutely, Marcel. Time flew by. I thank you for your insights, the work that you've been involved in, and also for listening and keeping up with my rants and my quirky ideas. Is there any final remarks that you would part with, or ideas or topics?
I can recommend a video game. You want me to do that?
There you go. Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
So I would say, this is an indie game. There's two of them actually. There's Orwell. It's Orwell, and it's Orwell 2. And I would say it's a game where you play as sort of a kind of an intelligence analyst. You're essentially like an investigator for this, this fantasy sort of 1984 Orwellian state. But the way that you play the game is you have a fake desktop and you interact with different sites and tools and stuff. And so I'm not gonna sit here and pretend that it's gonna be more fun than Call of Duty necessarily, but it is it is sort of interesting. It is interesting to see, how video games talk about, the role of intelligence as the government does it. So it is, those are interesting, and they're usually, on sale for pretty cheap, and you don't need a very good computer to run it. So I think those are worth checking out if you have some free time and you're predisposed to games.
Great. Is there any other cultural recommendation? I completely forgot to ask you this. Apologies.
I'm rewatching Narcos.
All right.
With Mrs. on Netflix. That's
any particular reason?
She hadn't seen it before, my wife.
Oh, okay.
So that's part of the reason. But I think it's interesting to rewatch it. I think when it came out, I was still a teenager. I was in college, so I wasn't very far into my career at all. So it's interesting watching it after, having worked in intelligence for a few years, not with the DEA necessarily. And obviously they move things around and romanticize and exaggerate a lot in the show. But it is interesting to come at it from a new perspective. And it's interesting to see, early Pedro Pascal, who's really hot in Hollywood right now.
He is. I mean, I think there was a short cameo in Game of Thrones also that he had.
Yeah. It was that in Game of Thrones really early on, but I feel like he's just really blown up between Last of Us, which I haven't seen yet, and he was in the Nick Cage movie.
Yeah, but Mandalorian too.
Oh yeah, Mandalorian, of course. Yeah, but he's he's sort of he's not really. I mean, he's in it.
Yeah, Yeah. He's not really. His face is not really in it.
Yeah.
All right. You reminded me. I wanted to give. I know I'm a little bit late to the game, but I wanted to give like a huge shout out to Andor, the show.
Absolutely.
The Star Wars show. Andor, I think from my own personal career and knowing something about counterinsurgency and how counterintelligence works, how networks are run, that show really does a fantastic job. Whoever advised on that show knows what they're talking about.
Yeah, I think some of the writers were involved in like the Americans and the Bourne movies. So I think they were taking a lot of that sort of good work and applying it to the Star Wars universe. And God, did Star Wars need a more mature, thoughtful, franchise?
Absolutely. I love The Mandalorian, and we are just waiting for it to finish so we can binge it. But yeah, Andor was absolutely and it's a bit slow burn in the beginning, but it's really, really good. I mean, it's one of the best recommendations that you guys have given me. I know multiple people in the team have been telling me to watch it, and I've not, but now I have finally. So I feel that I waited a little bit too long, but it is a very cool show. It's a very interesting show. There's another one that I walked into by accident while I was traveling, and I had nothing to do. So I found this show. It's called, I think it's called Condor, and it's with, I forgot his name. He just won an Oscar for The Whale.
Oh, Brendan Fraser?
He was in Brendan Fraser. That's it. Yeah. Brendan Fraser has an amazing role in it, but it's a story about an intelligence analyst that gets involved into something that he shouldn't be involved in, and his whole team gets taken out, and then it becomes like a whole chase. And it's basically what Jack Ryan should have been the last season, and even the second season. I know that people give Jack Ryan the show hard time, but the last season was a bit all over the place, and I think the first season is amazing. It's really good.
Yeah, it's good. It's good TV.
Yeah, but the second and the third one not like. But Condor is really good. if you're interested in any like intel security related topics. And I've been playing. We talked about this already privately, but I've been trying to play Ghost of Tsushima.
Oh yeah.
And I was playing it on hard setting. It's been an absolute slog to get through that, but really cool game.
Yeah, well, it's from adversity comes discipline and skill, right?
There you go.
I'm sure there's
that's a good one to.
Yeah, you're doing your own pressure makes diamonds.
Yeah, only if diamonds are valuable. I don't know if me finishing the game, it's a really valuable knowledge.
But it's insurgency experience.
There you go. It is actually insurgency experience.
Yeah,
that's a good one. Actually, I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, you can expense it.
Yeah, the game is actually from an insurgent's perspective, right?
Yeah,
it's very interesting. Yeah, again, thank you so much, Marcel. It was really good, and we will see you soon. Enough, you'll pop up again.
Oh yeah, you can't get rid
of these episodes. Yeah, we tried and tried, but it's not working. And yeah, for people listening, thank you. If you made it this far, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I've gotten so many positive remarks. I don't think there's anything that we as Great Dynamics, as a team, and me individually are involved in that has given me so much positive feedback or feedback in general. And I want to thank everybody. You know who you are, the people that reach out to me personally and that have been fans of the podcast. Thank you so much. If I can ask you guys a favor, there's something that would help us a lot. First of all, we are on YouTube now. So clips of the podcast as well as the full podcast. And soon we're going to do like video reports that are going to be on our YouTube page. So subscribe please to that. And secondly, if you listen to the podcast on Spotify, on Apple, I know most of you guys listen to it on Apple. Please, give us a review and give us feedback. Give us whatever you think we deserve, because that's really helpful. And subscribe to Great Dynamics. It also helps us keep this podcast out free from ads and sponsors, and because I don't really want to do that, but it's cutting more and more into my time. But if you guys subscribe, it helps us continue to do this and keeps us a high level of content as well as guests coming on. So, thank you guys for that. One last thing I wanted to mention was on the 12th of April. So if you're listening after the 12th of April to this podcast, I'm sorry about that, but you can listen to the recording. I think, we are launching, our report that we did with RUSI and the Royal United Services Institute. That's it. Yeah. Apologies. And the UN Women, a project that we did, a year-long project last year on the influence or the potential impact of Al-Shabaab terrorist group in Kenyan elections from 2022 perspective, but also we've done a historical analysis looking at incidents in 2017 elections and 12-13. So if you're interested in that, you want to know anything about it, there's a webinar that I will be speaking and answering questions together with some of my awesome colleagues from both these organizations and from the Reinvent team, which is more a long-term counter-terrorism or counter-violent extremism project that is being run in Kenya. And if you're interested in those type of topics, come by, ask questions, or just listen and support us on all the platforms. We will also share Marcel's socials and where you can bother him instead of me. Marcel, is there anything that you're working on that's coming out?
Besides our work on the course, I think I'm going to be talking at Georgetown's Africa-China initiative on Wagner very briefly. I'll be one of 3 speakers since it's the Africa-China initiative, not the Africa-China Wagner initiative. I'm sort of a black sheep there. And I should have articles coming out soon for the Irregular Warfare Center, which is a West Point and other institutions joint publication, and one for CTC Sentinel, which is a West Point publication as well. And that stuff's on one-way attack drones and Wagner, respectively. So, it's moving at the speed of academia. So look out for that in 2 to 3 years, whenever they release it.
I mean, if you look at it though, you've been very prolific in your publications. So you've been doing a great job at that.
Yeah, it's a way to deal with anxiety. Just publish endlessly.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. I would say this, right? We are working on a project. I don't know if it's going to be published or not on Wagner. 2 projects actually. One I know is going to be published, but I don't want to say too much about it because it's still early days. But there's another one that we might be doing with a media organization. Marcel probably knows which one that is, but...
oh yeah, very exciting stuff.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that yet, but we'll see. Marcel, again, thank you so much, man. I appreciate all your efforts, your insights. And there's some people who asked me, by the way, on our Instagram. I'm going to get Marcel involved this weekend. I'm going to bother him to be involved in our Ask Me Anything. If you have any questions for Marcel, specifically his experience, please ask me so he can answer some questions in our Saturday AMAs that we do. That would be good if he doesn't mind, obviously.
Oh yeah, no. I'll definitely answer questions.
Yeah, because there's one question that I got a lot is from US service members, former service members, as well as active service members that want to join the intelligence community in the US. And I think you can give them some good insights from an analyst perspective.
Oh yeah, you could do a whole podcast on that.
Yeah, don't give me ideas, man. I'm also afraid that my British followers and supporters will feel like, hey, why are you highlighting the US so much and not giving, let alone, the Europeans. But we're gonna do more. I'm hoping to do a series on intelligence and special operations, and we're hoping to have like people, maybe even active duty people as guests on the podcast. We're not sure if they're going to be just guests on the podcast or we're going to do video interviews, but that's something that we are working on. If you are an analyst in the special operations capacity, please reach out. I would love to hear from you. I know a lot of you have already reached out, but that's the stuff that I don't really can talk about. But if you wanna be a guest or whatever, yeah, let me know. I'm really interested.
Yeah, show us your challenge coins.
Yeah. There you go. All right, guys. Thank you again, and I see you next week.